are talking Evidence from 2012, and this is directed by Howie Askins and written by Ryan McCoy, who also has a role in the movie. And this is a found footage film that I hadn't seen before this year. This is actually requested by a viewer of the channel, so thank you for this. And this is a movie which is 2 parts exists, the movie exists, and 1 part Resident Evil is the kind of the log line I would say to best describe this movie. Now, I reviewed a film a little while ago called The Wild Man, Legend of the Skunk Ape or something it was called. And one of the kind of the things I said about that film was it started out like a typical kind of found footage movie, and around the 3rd act a sharp left turn into a very unexpected territory. And this is true of this film, even though this film actually came out a lot before the Skunk Ape movie. Now, what is the basic story here? Well, it focuses on 4 friends, and one of these friends is deciding he's going to do some type of documentary, and then that's the reason why they're filming and everything. And they decide they're going to go off in the woods, do some camping, etc. And when they're there, they hear strange kind of sounds in the woods. They kind of see something in the distance which looks a little bit inhuman, and they're soon menaced by what could be some type of creature or even creatures. However, things have only started going wrong for this group of friends as things take a dramatic turn for the worse as the film progresses. Now, what will happen, I'm not going to spoil it for you clearly, you have to watch the movie and find out. So let's discuss. Now, you had to talk about this movie in kind of portions really. The first 2/3 of this movie plays very much like a standard creature in the woods style found footage movie, whilst the last third is very different. Still found footage and everything, but it takes a little bit of a different twist. So we're going to kind of like talk about them, and then we'll talk about those sections kind of individually. What did I think worked in this movie? Well, yeah, like I've said, it's kind of like a movie with 2 distinct different kind of portions to it. So if variety is the spice of life, then you're going to enjoy this movie. And that's not even true of the way this film is kind of directed. It's kind of what's the antagonists and the antagonistic forces in this movie have a little bit of variety within them as well. This movie, I think, does a good job, I think, of setting up the characters. We get to know our 4 friends fairly well. And I will say, certainly in the first act, they all seem pretty kind of down-to-earth kind of people, and kind of, you know, they seem like kind of genuine friends, which I kind of quite liked. And we don't get too much kind of like long setup before anything happens. Yes, it really kind of kicks off in the kind of the 3rd act, but we do have things happening before that as well. Not to the degree, admittedly, but I think it's a good building of the tension. We can, you know, we hear sounds. There's a few kind of like red herrings and things like that, and you know, a couple of kind of almost like lighter encounters until the kind of the more frantic kind of 3rd act. But I thought the actual kind of like the ramping up of the kind of the tension was pretty good. I thought the acting was solid. Now, I'm going to come back to the way the characters are written, but I think the acting, the performances were solid from this kind of movie. It's clearly not a high budget movie, but I do think they've made good use of the budget, especially as the movie progresses. Things, you know, explode into a much more of a wider scale is the best way I would describe it, with kind of like more things kind of going on. And it's clear, obviously, they've had to kind of hide certain aspects to kind of like make up for a lack of budget, but I think they do that kind of reasonably well. And this movie, I think if you're a fan of more of a kind of an action, you know, high kind of impact, frantic kind of pace movie, although it does obviously start out a little slow, I think this may be a film for you. I recently talked about another found footage film called The Mere House, which was a very slow and slow movie with not a lot happening in it, but it had a kind of a more realistic approach. And one of the kind of the things I said about that film was it sacrifices realism for entertainment. This movie is kind of the opposite to a certain degree. It's much more of a kind of in-your-face kind of movie with lots of things kind of happening, especially in that kind of later section of the movie. It's kind of more along the lines of Grave Encounters, if you can compare that to, say, Blair Witch, if you want to compare maybe more well-known kind of found footage movies. So if you're a fan of, say, Grave Encounters over the Blair Witch, then you may want to check this one out. But it doesn't have quite the kind of the production value of maybe Grave Encounters. And once we get into that third act, like I say, it's pretty much non-stop and it is fast-paced. Now, the movie doesn't spoon-feed you information. I'm going to come on to it again in a minute. But it gives you enough, I think, to get you an idea about what's going on, deliberately so. One of the critiques that I'm going to say about in a minute, and I think would be levelled about this movie in general, is you don't quite know what's going on. But I think that's by design. It's not a kind of a cause that the storytellers here haven't done a good job of kind of explaining things. I think the choice was taken here to have a lot of this kind of like unexplained and just hinting at what's going on. So you get the vague, you get a broad idea about what might be happening, and it's enough, I think, to be satisfying for most. I watched this movie, and you can kind of piece the bits together. If you've got my Resident Evil comparison, that may give you some idea. You might say also maybe Cabin in the Woods might be another kind of example. I'm not going to say any more than that. But I think, yeah, it gives enough, in my opinion, to kind of like, I think, satisfy most people. But let's talk about what does not work, and let me just kind of carry on from that. Because if you are a person that requires everything to be explained, this movie may leave you cold. I was curious to see what the general feedback of this movie was. So I did check out a couple of reviews after I watched it, before I recorded this one, clearly. And the vast majority of the feedback was, I didn't know what was going on. I couldn't really work it out. So I personally feel it does enough, just about, to kind of not answer everything, certainly, but give you the vaguest idea about what's actually kind of going on, especially in reference to the kind of the third act. But I think there is an argument to be said for it. It may leave you with a little bit high and dry, certainly with some aspects, and certainly with what it portrays to the kind of like the degree that it portrays it in regards to the kind of the scale of it. Maybe I think maybe it could have potentially explained a little more, giving you a little bit more kind of context. But you have to bear in mind you're seeing it from the perspective of an outsider, someone who's got into this kind of situation, who's the people holding the camera who may not know this. So that's kind of one of the, I think, the overreaching criticisms seen for this movie, and I do understand it, and I think it will bother some people, not others. But it's kind of, again, apologies to be vague there, but there it is. But what else can I say? So let's talk about the characters. Now, I've mentioned I like the performances, and I actually have to say I think the first act did a good job of portraying these characters as genuine friends. However, I will say the second act, and this is before things get really crazy, I thought it kind of like backtracked or backslid more like on that characterization. Because we have a character called Ryan, who was actually the writer of the movie, ironically, and his character just seems unrealistically selfish, is the best way I would describe it. Compared to what we've seen from him previously, and compared to what we're meant to believe these group of friends would be like, it seems to, unrealistically selfish attitude towards his friends in the second act of this movie, to the point where I thought it was actually a little unrealistic. But there's also other things that I think will, that could betray the found footage aesthetic to a certain degree. This battery on this camera, and bear in mind this is like a trip in the woods, this isn't somewhere where they can recharge, must be the most powerful battery you've ever seen. And bear in mind this is a 2012 film, so that's where technology was back then. I mean, this battery seems to be never ending. It's one of the kind of like the little problems you're going to come across with kind of found footage. But that's not the only one. the whole conceit of a documentary seems very kind of just like mentioned but not really expanded upon. What is a documentary about? We don't know. It's just kind of like, yeah, well, it just seems like it was just a throwaway line as an excuse to film things, but you don't really understand the context of what this is meant to be about. And this is ultimately the reason why they're filming and the reason why we have a found footage film. But it just seems to be very arbitrary and kind of, oh yeah, we'll just say a couple of lines, it's meant to be a documentary, and that'll do. But we also have, again, the movie has a lot of shaky cam in it, which is the more realistic kind of way these movies, or this, if this were to happen in real life, would you know, be and end up. There are, for example, scenes where we have a character running through the woods and we have another character in front of them, yet they're always managed to keep them in frame. So and just imagine what that would look like. You've got, you know, you're running away from something, there's someone in front of you, but you're managing to keep this person in frame whilst you're running, you know, not worried too much clearly about the beastie behind you. Now, the flip side of that, it's just going to be like you know, like waving all over the place, which obviously was not good for a film perspective. But that's the danger of found footage, isn't it? That's when you're going to come up against problems with the kind of the format. So I certainly don't think this is kind of a found footage movie where it kind of like you can kind of get so involved in it because it's kind of filmed in such a way that it kind of brings you in. I think they take a lot of liberties with the kind of the found footage kind of aesthetic to make it seem, you know, not quite as believable as maybe some, and they've kind of favoured spectacle or you know, more dramatic elements or unrealistic elements at times. So that's kind of more of your you know, your kind of overreaching kind of issues with that. And then, as I say, the third act, which is where stuff really kind of goes bananas, is certainly very interesting. But there's a lot of questions, and yet the special effects are you know, a mixed bag. But we don't see anything too kind of like quick, you know, too kind of in detail. It's all very, very quick. There doesn't seem to be any lighting in this kind of, that we have an interior situation, and there doesn't seem to be any lighting, clearly to hide budgetary issues, but again, this is an interior complex that we're in, but there's no lights apparently. There's certain kind of aesthetic choices with antagonists running around in gas masks, and then why? You know, I get that we want to be mysterious and we kind of want to leave a lot of it to the imagination, but there are questionable choices at least. So yeah, I mean, it's clearly not a movie that I think is too worried about breaking the illusion that it's obviously real found footage, but it's an entertaining one, I think, and it does have some flaws. I think it maybe in the writing and kind of the execution of the you know, of the aesthetic of found footage, but it's an entertaining one. You know, and I get it, if you're a fan of the more frantic paced Grave Encounter style found footage film, I would check it out, but I don't think it's quite as good as that. But it's an entertaining one. I'll give it a 6 out of 10, above average if you ask me. Above average movie, but it is kind of like, it has some elements I think could have been better. 6 out of 10, what did you think of this movie if you've seen it, or does it strike your fancy if you haven't? Please do leave me a comment, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.